In D&D and other tabletop RPGs, bards are usually pantaloon-wearing yahoos strumming on lutes and having sex with dragons, right? Wrong. If this is what you think about when you think of a bard, you couldn't be more wrong. In today's thought experiment, we will take a look at my favorite RPG class and unravel the history of the mighty bard. The word bard comes from the old Celtic word bardo, or bardi, and the Webster Dictionary describes a bard as a tribal poet-singer known for composing and reciting verses on heroes and their deeds, or as a composer, singer, or declaimer of epic heroic verse. Bardic tradition has its roots in ancient Celtic culture, and back in those days, bards were extremely important. Back in ancient times, in the days before the internet or even books, the only way to record information was in the memories of living people, and bards were needed to remember the stories, poems, and tales and collective lore of their entire people. Bardic tradition grew up out of the practices of druidry, and bards and druids were looked on as leaders, wisdoms, holy people, and seers of the future. The line between bards and druids is a fine one, and there's a lot of overlap in the functions and their roles in society. Broadly speaking, bards, or fili, were concerned with acting more as historians, remembering the past in the form of poetry, and as seers to predict the future, while druids would have been more in the line of holy people. It's important to establish that when we say poems, we're not talking about modern poems full of subtext and flowery imagery. We're talking about epic poems that would have gone on for hours and only rhymed or had meter to make them easier to remember. The poems of ancient days were much less Tennyson and much more like Wikipedia. Passed down from master to apprentice and memorized in full, these incredibly long poems were the repository of the history, wisdom, and identity of the entire culture. And bards, the keepers of these oral traditions, were immensely important. It should also be noted that bards were poets, not necessarily musicians. Epic poetry might be accompanied by a drum or a harp, but they were much more like stories than songs. Among the levels of the bard during the ancient Celtic days, the fili were the most important. Fili were on par with kings in terms of their importance. A king could not act without wisdom, and the fili were that wisdom. They knew the accounts of the old battles. They were masters of strategy and logistics. They had the ear of the gods and the power of magic at their fingertips. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that bards controlled history, since they were the ones that remembered the events. And if you crossed one, it could be disastrous. The stories that bards told were considered to be historic accounts, and were believed implicitly. For this reason, a bard's tale would become known facts, not opinions. It was a seriously bad idea, therefore, to annoy a bard, because they could ruin your reputation with a word, and everyone would believe them. If the bard said something nasty about you in one of their poems, everyone would believe it, and cutting off the bard's tongue or hanging them from the walls of your city would only convince people of the truth of the bard's accusations. Not only that, but to insult the bard was a very bad idea, since bards had the ear of the gods and were also believed to channel divine power with their words. Many of the Celtic gods, like Lu the Light Hand and the Dagda, were depicted as playing lyres or harps to tremendous effect. Lu could, using his voice, encourage things to grow and change shape, or inspire a wellspring of energy in a fighter that would make him incapable of growing tired. Conversely, the power of the voice could also be used to take the energy away from the body. And the gods like the Dagda were said to be able to put an entire army to sleep with a word. This idea wasn't exclusive to the Celts either. In Norse mythology, Odin had the ability to shape and change things just by speaking, and even bring things to life with the power of his voice. All this word of power stuff sounds very arcane, and I'm sure many wizard players are probably like, psh, we can do that too. It's just basic spellcasting with verbal components. The thing is that the idea of wizards is derived from the idea of druids and, as we've already seen, from bards. Even the mighty Merlin, probably the best-known wizard in the world, historically was described as a post-Roman bard or druid, telling the future and advising the kings of Britain. Doug Schweikman, the original creator of D&D Bards, understood this and designed the bards accordingly. He stated in Strategic Review magazine in 1976, when the Bard class first debuted, that he wanted the Bard to be a fusion of the Celtic Bard, the Nordic Skald, and the Southern European Minstrel, but that the focus should be on the first two rather than the last. Initially, the Bard class was supposed to act more like a fighter than just some lute-strumming muppet. In fact, the original Advanced D&D Player's Handbook describes bards thusly. Bards begin play as fighters, and they must remain exclusively as fighters until they have achieved at least 5th level of experience. Anytime thereafter, and in any event prior to attaining 8th level, they must change their class to that of thieves. Again, sometime between 5th and 9th level of ability, bards must leave off thieving and begin clerical studies as druids. But at this time, they are actually bards and under druidical tutelage. Fighters, druids, wizards, and wise men, bards were historically one of the most important members of society. And even now, the power of the pen or voice cannot be understated. The idea of some wandering minstrel with a lute and a feather in his cap we associate with the bard class today needs to change. Bards aren't lame. Bards are awesome. They are the repositories of wisdom, the seers of the future, advisors of kings, and conduits for the gods. They know much and forget nothing, and they keep their eyes and mind open and are always creative. Thanks for watching.